9 Interesting Facts about Napoleon Bonaparte. How much do you know about His Imperial and Royal Majesty Napoleon I? Known as an outstanding and ambitious military tactician, and a formidable strategist, Napoleon went on to conquer much of Europe, including the countries of Italy, Austria, Poland, Germany, Holland, Denmark, and Norway, in the early 19th century. And in his conquests, he cemented what is called the Napoleonic Code in France, and also in all the territories that were under his rule at that time. Napoleon is one of the world's most fascinating figures to be studied or talked about, and we will look at 9 interesting facts about him. Number 1. Napoleon initially hated France. Napoleon was born on the island of Corsica, an island in the Mediterranean Sea, and a colony of France. He would spend his early age with a fierce hatred for the French, their mannerism, audacity, and the fact that they took the independence of his people. Being a Corsican noble, although not from a so affluent background, he had greater opportunities to study than was available to a typical Corsican of the time. This would lead him to leave Corsica at the age of 10 to school in France, where he was subject to several bullying and sarcastic remarks from his French classmates, mostly because of his accent, birthplace, presumed short stature, and inability to speak French fluently. In his late teens and early 20s, he was what you would describe as a Corsican nationalist. And in many of his letters, he didn't mince his words on how he felt about France. In one of the letters written to his mentor, Pasquale Paoli, the then leader of Corsica, he wrote,
"As the nation was perishing I was born. 30,000 Frenchmen were vomited onto our shores, drowning the throne of liberty in waves of blood. Such was the odious sight which was the first to strike me."
In another, he also wrote,
"Whatever the success of my work may be, I feel it will raise against me the whole crowd of French civil servants who govern our island, and whom I attack. But does it really matter if it is for the sake of our country?"
But then, things would change, and Napoleon would go on to have a change of trajectory, one that will change the course of history. A time would come when he would realize that the Corsican elites weren't as noble as he had thought, and were just as corrupt as the French. They were collecting bribes, and selling the freedom of Corsicans. He would spend the early years of the French Revolution in Corsica, fighting in a complex three-way struggle among royalists, revolutionaries, and Corsican nationalists, and also leading riots against the French army in Corsica. The straw that broke the camel's back was the rivalry between him and Paoli, which would cause Napoleon and his family to flee to the French mainland in order to save their heads. After which, Napoleon would turn his back on his island once and for all, without ever looking back, not even during his reign as emperor. Next up is about the emperor's first wife. A woman, 6 years older than he was. Number 2. Napoleon's first wife was so close to losing her head. Empress Josephine Bonaparte was the first wife of Napoleon. But before Napoleon, she was married to Alexandre de Beauharnais, a French general sentenced to the guillotine during the Reign of Terror. He was tagged an aristocratic suspect and was arrested for poorly defending Mainz after it was besieged. And his arrest also led to the arrest of his wife, Josephine. She was also to be executed, but by some stroke of luck, was freed 5 days after her husband lost his head. Chiefly because Robespierre, the main orchestrator behind the Reign of Terror, was executed, and Josephine was freed afterward. After the end of the Reign of Terror, Josephine would go on to meet Napoleon, who was 6 years her junior. Their relationship was more of a boy-mistress relationship, and Napoleon was so love-struck that they were married barely a year later. But when Napoleon became the Emperor of France, and Josephine, the Empress, their marriage was plagued with several hitches. And her inability to produce an heir would lead to Napoleon seeking a divorce, albeit a quiet and amicable one. Number 3. Napoleon once wrote a romance novel. Yes, His Imperial and Royal Majesty Napoleon I, Emperor of the French, King of Italy, mediator of the Swiss Confederation, protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, wrote a freaking romance novel. Odd, right? I think so too. Well, it is a novella titled Clisson and Eugenie. And it is widely acknowledged as being a fictionalized account of the doomed romance between a soldier and his lover, which is said to parallel Napoleon's own relationship with Eugenie Desirée Clary, his one-time fiancée before he met his first wife. In the novella, Clisson is a heroic revolutionary French soldier who was tired of war. He would meet Eugenie at a public bath and fall in love with her. And after retiring from the military, he and Eugenie get married and raise several children within a perfect countryside retreat. But war returns and Clisson feels compelled to serve his country, which he does. Then, in battle, unfortunately, he is injured, and he sends his comrade Breville to reassure Eugenie. Breville, however, screws him over and seduces her, and then stops delivering Clisson's letters to her. Heartbroken at the end of his marriage, Clisson then sends off one final letter to his unfaithful wife and her new lover before deliberately engineering his death at the front of an armed charge toward the enemy. Number 4. Napoleon and his army discovered the Rosetta Stone. You might be wondering, how on earth is that important? Well, the ancient Egyptians believed that it was important to record and communicate information about religion and government. Thus, they invented written scripts that could be used to record this information. The most famous of all ancient Egyptian scripts is hieroglyphic. These scripts were important in ancient Egypt for the transference of ideas, and for passing cultural messages and information from one generation to the next, thereby having a more cohesive society. But before the 19th century, the world's understanding of the ways of ancient Egypt was practically non-existent. This was because no one knew how to decipher the hieroglyphs. The use of the Egyptian writing system arose in the early Bronze Age, and stayed loosely to sometime around the 5th century, after which the knowledge of its use was lost. In the 19th century, during the Napoleonic campaign in Egypt, soldiers in Napoleon's army discovered the Rosetta Stone while making repairs to a fort, near the town of El Rashid, called Rosetta, by Europeans. The Rosetta Stone helped scholars at long last, to crack the code of ancient Egypt's writing system, as it held the key to understanding Egyptian hieroglyphs. The hieroglyphics told stories of how the ancient Egyptians lived and worked. It explained why it was important for them to preserve the bodies of people and animals. It was discovered that they mummified the bodies of their dead because they believed that the physical body would be important in the next life. Thus, preserving the body in as lifelike a way as possible was the goal of mummification. On Napoleon's defeat, the stone became the property of the British, along with other antiquities that the French had found. It is currently a monument in the British Museum. Number 5. Napoleon once attempted suicide. In 1814, after the Allied coalition of Austria had driven Napoleon back to France, and Paris had been captured, Napoleon abdicated the throne, after which he was exiled to Elba. Having lost the empire, his throne, his wife and son, and his followers, he then tried to commit suicide, rather than resign himself to a life in exile. Truthfully, throughout his time in power, Napoleon was never more than a few seconds away from suicide. He always wore a vial of opium around his neck. I guess the goal was, kill yourself before you allow anyone to kill you or capture you. At the time of his exile to Elba, he decided it was time to put an end to his misery and drank from the opium. It had, however, weakened over the years and he only got extremely sick. Number 6. Napoleon couldn't sing to save his life. According to multiple sources, Napoleon had a bad habit. He was a compulsive singer. And whenever he got fidgety or nervous, out would come the repetitive humming and mumbling. Now that's not so bad, right? Well, yeah, that's if you are not as tone deaf like Napoleon was described to be. Imagine the Emperor of France singing way off key with his people around, and no one had the nerve to tell him to stop. According to one Betsy Balcombe, a friend of Napoleon's, she had a thing to say about Napoleon's singing.
He began to hum the air, became abstracted, and, leaving his seat, marched around the room, keeping time to the song he was singing. In fact, Napoleon's voice was most unmusical, nor do I think he had any ear for music, for neither on this occasion nor in any of his subsequent attempts at singing, could I ever discover what tune it was he was executing.
What do you think would happen if you heard Napoleon sing, and you're bold enough to tell him? For Christ's sake, accept it. You can't sing to save your life. Let's leave you to decide what would happen. Good thing is, Napoleon wasn't a classical singer. His job was to be the emperor to his people. One he did well. This leads to the next fact. Number 7. Napoleon was what you would call a religious opportunist. Having been raised as a Catholic, Napoleon was said to have never developed much faith in religion. He was not irreligious in the ordinary sense of the word. In fact, he would doubt the existence of true atheism. But although he wasn't religious, there was one thing, however, that Napoleon was. He was an opportunist. He had a keen appreciation of the power of organized religion in social and political affairs, and he paid a great deal of attention to bending it to his purposes. When crossing the plains of Italy with his army, he professed a love for Catholicism. But when marching through the sands of Egypt, he found an unremitting love for Islam. To Napoleon, religion was useful as long as it was comforting to society, but dangerous if it leads to fanaticism. He recognized the necessity of having an ideology for the masses so that he could cement his control over them. And religion was one thing he saw that worked as a great people cement. Funny enough, his use for religion is one reason the next fact is part of this list. Number 8. Napoleon preferred dogs to cats. If Napoleon lived in the 21st century in the time of the battle between the cat lovers and the dog lovers, he would undoubtedly favor the canine end of the battle. Napoleon was said to have liked dogs for their slavish loyalty and was indifferent to cats because he thought them lazy and languid. As a man who is said to have liked to be in control of people, and one who isn't really pleased with those who were independent thinkers, you can see why he would tilt towards the dog end of the battle. He regarded dogs as loyal, and he despised the felines for their independent nature, a nature that didn't suit him, or his course. Napoleon is truly one of the greatest men to walk the earth. But there have been several questions surrounding his death. Number 9. Napoleon's death is still a mystery. Since he presumably died in British custody on the island of St. Helena in 1821, the claims that Napoleon Bonaparte was either murdered or spirited off the island have never completely gone away. The original autopsy findings declared the cause of his death to be stomach cancer. This finding has been supported by the fact that during Napoleon's time in power, he often posed for paintings with his hand in his vest. This has led to some speculation after his death that he had indeed been plagued by stomach pain for years. But then, several accusations of foul play have also swirled around. Some speculate that he was murdered after high levels of arsenic were found on his hair. This accusation, however, was debunked, as some new analysis suggests that the high levels of arsenic in his hair were present throughout his life. This implies that he was not poisoned at the end of his life while in exile. Rather, he probably absorbed arsenic constantly throughout his life. Meanwhile, several conspiracy theories have been created over the years. Some believe that Napoleon was substituted and that the man who died was someone else. Some others say that the body of Napoleon that was exhumed by the British at the request of the French in 1840 was a mismatch. They believe that Napoleon's body should have already decomposed, but the body exhumed was in excellent condition. Finally, the French government has continually refused to allow DNA tests on Napoleon's remains, an honor to the emperor's legacy, I'd say. But one that would only add to the conspiracy theories. That's all for now, and I bet you now know a thing or two that you previously didn't about Napoleon Bonaparte. If you enjoyed this, then subscribe to this channel for more of this kind of content.